Welcome, everybody. Monday night, 6 o'clock, Exodus. Baron Fong is presenting tonight in the first half of our time together, so I'll say a prayer and then turn it over to Baron. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you for the blessings of this day and for these 2 hours together to pursue again the narrative of your Exodus of the people of Israel, what we might learn from that about our own lives, and what we might learn from that to apply in the ministry and service of others according to your word and will. Amen. Okay, so as we did last time, Baron will present, and if somebody has a question, you can raise your hand and I'll call. And I am recording, that's going. So Baron, it's all yours.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I'll be going over Exodus chapter 7, verses 1 through 9:18. So let's go ahead and advance to the next slide and we'll get going here. Okay, so basically I'm trying to give here just a quick summary of where we're at when we start our look at chapter 7. So as you see, this is the breakdown from Durham's book, the progeny of Israel, persecution and the deliverer, which is the part 1, the first section, which is from the first week. Then also next, the call of the deliverer, his commission and his obedience, which we covered partially from the first session and the last session that we had. So it starts into with chapter 7. So we're moving into the 10 mighty acts, or the 10 plagues that is more commonly known as. But Exodus, and Durham uses this phrase, the proof of Yahweh's presence. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind for all the things that we see happening, especially in this narrative that we'll be getting into tonight. Next slide, please. So this slide is also taken from Durham's book. I look at this as sort of like it's almost like a promotion for a trailer for a movie, almost like. So let me just go ahead and just read it. Okay, thus Yahweh is orchestrating in a combination of opposing and unlikely forces, a deliverance that will above all be a proof of his active presence. A reluctant Moses, an unbelieving Pharaoh, a crushed and dispirited Israel, a proud and ruling Egyptian people, a non-nation against the greatest of nations, are brought together, and the opposing sides are set still more firmly in their respective ways, so that the proof of Yahweh's presence, which is to turn everything upside down, may be established irrevocably. Even as Moses and Aaron speak Yahweh's words of command to Pharaoh, Yahweh will increase Pharaoh's resistance, thus creating an impasse. So in terms of our, I guess, opening hour here, I have a number of slides to go over. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer questions as we go, but maybe just try to hold off your questions until the end. I'll try to get through these slides. We've got to be covering a number of different points. And then maybe we could hold off on questions, and maybe at the end we'll get to them as best as I can. All right. Okay, next slide. Okay, next slide. It's just a quick summary of each of the plagues, the 10 plagues. I don't know if you can see it, but it's broken down, showing the specific passages, beginning with turning the Nile into blood, which is verses 14 to 24 in chapter 7, and so on down the line. So the 10 plagues, and it is first the blood, then the frogs, and then the gnats, flies, then the death of the livestock for the Egyptians, and then boils. So that's where I'll end tonight, covering or just talking about the 6. And then I guess tomorrow night will be the remainder, hail, locusts, darkness, and firstborn. Actually, I won't be getting into too much detail for each one. So I think it's just a amazing thing in the way that Durham uses the word mighty acts instead of the 10 plagues. Because I feel when we talk or think about the 10 plagues, even the word plague is not a very pleasant word to consider. Because you could think of suffering and death and so on. But as we know, all things that happen, even as what we call things that happen in nature, is still controlled by God. So they are actually mighty acts of God because only God could really make such things happen. Next slide, please. So here's another section I pulled out of Durham's book. And this is getting into the idea that some commentators have with regard to trying to figure out the significance of these different plagues or mighty acts that God did to the Egyptians. So let me just go ahead again and read this here. It is at least beside the point to contend, as some commentators do, that the first plague is more serious and a greater threat than the second. The mighty acts are not weighted from mild to serious, and the application to the sequence of logical patterns of increased or decreased power or intensity of effect is misleading. Each of the accounts is to the same end, and their cumulative effect is a magnification of repetition, not increasing degree. What I believe Durham is sort of saying here is, don't get too caught up into all the details of each of the plays themselves, because as we will see, other commentators might say things like, "Oh, well, the reason why the Nile was turned to blood was because the Nile was such an important aspect for the Egyptians because it was like the primary source of water." And I think in some ways Egyptians also have many gods, so that they worship. I'm not sure they actually worship the Nile, but they have a number of different gods that they worship, and each one of the plagues, whether it be the frogs or the gnats or the flies, somehow it gets into the many gods the Egyptians have. So in some ways, I look at Durham as trying to say, don't get too caught up with each of the plagues themselves, but just look at what happens at the end with all these plagues and the impact it had on the Egyptian people and how the Pharaoh reacted. Next slide. So here's another commentary that I picked out from the Logos that I found, and it's from the commentary on the Old Testament, and it reads as follows. Okay, the first three plagues covered the whole land and fell upon the Israelites as well as the Egyptians. With the fourth, the separation commenced between Egyptians and Israelites, so that only the Egyptians suffered from the last six. The Israelites in Goshen being entirely exempted. The last three, again, were distinguished from the others by the fact that they were far more dreadful than any of the previous ones, and bore visible marks of being the forerunners of the judgment which would inevitably fall upon Pharaoh if he continued his opposition to the will of the Almighty God. So this is just another perspective that as if any of us were to look at the various commentaries or views of the 10 plagues or the 10 mighty acts, you will have a lot of different perspectives. And here in this commentary, it sort of summarizes the different ones and distinguishing them one from the other. Okay, I'm moving along sort of pretty fast here, but let me just move on, and then I'm sort of shifting gears here slightly. So that was what I covered, was sort of like a real quick summary of the 10 plagues overall. And next slide. I'm beginning to actually get into the passages themselves, beginning with the first 3 verses. So what I did here was do a side-by-side sort of comparison using the ESV and looking at Durham's so-called translation. So you can see some of the words here that are highlighted. So let me just get into some of these here. So the first verse, it says, okay, and the Lord, just from ESV, and the Lord said to Moses, see, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. So, Durham, clarifies they're saying that, okay, that Moses, okay, you must understand that I will make you a God as far as Pharaoh is concerned. So, earlier, when I looked at this verse, I recall something similar that was mentioned from chapter 4 last week, chapter 4, verse 15, when, again, God was speaking to Moses, and I'll just go ahead and read it. Exodus 4:15, it says, okay, you shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be your mouth, and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. So that's this relationship between Moses and Aaron, because Aaron was going to be essentially Moses' mouthpiece as he approaches the Pharaoh. So it's similar here when we look at verse 1 here, where it says that in the eyes of Pharaoh, Moses will be like God. All right. Okay. And then the other thing I just highlight here in verse 2, just difference between letting the people of Israel go versus the way Durham states it here is to send forth. I think this gets into what was raised, I think, earlier in the earlier sessions, is about why is it the people, the Israelites didn't just so-called leave Egypt. And when I look at these two ways of considering that situation, I've always heard basically Moses going to Pharaoh said, let my people go. In other words, the Pharaoh is holding them back and not letting them go. But yet Durham is saying here, and he won't basically send them forth. So that's like a different perspective, which I was sort of pondering over. Like, is it letting the people go, or is it the Pharaoh not sending them out? So that's just a question, and I wasn't sure, how to really, I don't know how Durham came up with this other approach in sending them forth as opposed to letting them go. Okay, and then verse 3, and this is what I'm getting into much more later, is about Pharaoh's heart being hardened. I'll spend some time talking about this aspect of the Exodus narrative in terms of Pharaoh's hardened heart. Professor Eshabat mentioned that a little bit last week, and I'll essentially talk about it again. So as you see here in green, for ESV, it says hardened Pharaoh's heart, but Durham uses Pharaoh stubborn-minded. in my mind, that's sort of a pretty strong distinction in the sense that if someone was to ask you the question, or you have a so-called change of mind, if you, let's say you were going to do something and you change your mind, I think that's so-called relatively easy to do. But how about changing your heart? Changing someone's heart, I think, is a tougher thing to do than changing someone's mind. So I thought that was interesting in the way Durham changes the perspective from Pharaoh's heart to Pharaoh's mind. All right. And then just a quick note. Oops. Am I looking at the? Nope. Sorry, I'm on the wrong. Back up the previous slide. Yeah. The thing in blue. Just another quick comment. The wonders, the signs and wonders, and Durham uses the word wondrous deeds. That just expands it a little bit because it focuses in more on the actual things that was done by God as opposed to just wonders. I think it just puts a little bit more focus. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the next 3 or 4 slides, I will just go through all the instances in the readings that I have in my section, 7:1 through 9:18, where we have the phrase in which Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And we'll dig a little bit deeper as we move forward into these various sense of the word, what's happening here when it comes to Pharaoh's heart being hardened. So Durham, throughout, again, uses the word mind. So here, so, but the mind of Pharaoh was unchanged. So what that basically says, from Durham's perspective here, is that Pharaoh's mind was already made up. He was already set in a certain way, not letting the people go or not sending forth the Israelites, and it was unchanged. So he already had a predisposition with a sense that he's not going to make any change. But so it's just talking about, okay, he was already preset in the way that he was thinking, and it was unchanged. Okay, next slide. So this is the first of the 10 plagues. Again, just focusing mainly on those in green, is when Pharaoh's heart is hardened. So in verse 14, it says again, his heart is hardened. And just as it's like a side note here, is letting the people go versus sending out the people in red. Then in verse 22, we see again, this relates to the first plague, or the first mighty act in which the Nile was turned to blood. Verse 22, okay, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. And you could look over on the comparison from Durham. He uses, I guess, further descriptive words and what it means when it says Pharaoh's heart is hardened. So Durham says for verse 14, the mind of Pharaoh is heavy and dull. So that adds another nuance to what the state of Pharaoh's mind was. So it was heavy and dull, like you can't move it, or it's like nothing's going to affect it. Okay, then we look at verse 22 in green again. It says, so Pharaoh's mind was again obstinate. So that's just like another way of saying it's extremely stubborn. It's like it's not going to change. All right. Next slide. Again, I'm going to just go through the various passages that focuses on the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. So in verse 15, as it pertains to the second plague for the frogs, in ESV, he hardened his heart. And Durham, he changes or adds another perspective and says, focusing on the green, he steeled his mind. It's like making it even tougher to penetrate, because he's going to make it like steel, which is harder to penetrate, right? So Durham, I in some way like the way he uses different words to explain the condition of Pharaoh's heart, because he throws in these various different ways of describing it, such as like here, steeled his mind, and previously it's heavy and dull. Mind was obstinate. Okay, so that's the second plague. And moving on to third and fourth for the next slide. Again, for the gnats and the flies, the same thing. So ESV verse 19, heart was hardened. And then Durham uses mind remain obstinate. All right, and then for the next verse pertaining to the flies in 8:32 is he hardened his heart, the same familiar phrase or words that we hear often when it comes to Pharaoh's heart, that his heart was hardened, and then he steeled his mind. Okay, I'm just running through the various verses pertaining to each of the plagues, and when there's mention of Pharaoh's hardened heart. Okay, next slide. Okay, then we get to the fifth and sixth plague. It's pretty much a repeat of what we heard earlier, in which we had the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and we have Pharaoh's mind remained heavy and dull. And then also the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. Now there's a change there, because now we see that it's not like so-called Pharaoh's fault in a sense, because that Pharaoh's heart was already made up, and it was his stance in not changing. And then we have a shift here with the sixth plague. Now we read that the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. And likewise, on Durham's commentary, he says, Yahweh made obstinate the mind of Pharaoh. So from what I see here, like a change in sort of perspective, like who's doing it? Is it because Pharaoh was so stubborn that he already made up his mind, so nothing's going to change him, to the point where now we see a shift in the sense that, okay, the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. But we'll touch on that a little bit more later. Okay, the next two slides. This next slide, please. On your screen, you probably can't really see it, so you might want to so-called like magnify a little bit on yours, on your own local, on your own PC, because there's that ability for you to magnify so that you could read it. So as I was doing some word studies on the word harden and using the Logos software, I came across, looks like 4 different Hebrew words that was used in describing what this word, the hardening or harden of Pharaoh's heart. So the first one, if you were to look at the top there, there's the various lexicons that are available. It gets into this idea about being made heavy and hard and difficult, stubborn, like not easily changed or not easily moved. Okay, and if we were to look at the word sense, or for like the verb, which is again still remaining, looking at the top there, is to make stubborn, which is a verb, to cause to be hardened or make stubborn. And this particular meaning of the word came from that word used in verse 3 of chapter 7. So 7:3, so that's the instance when this particular so-called meaning or Hebrew word was used here in verse 3. Then the second half of this page, we have a different word. And I haven't taken Hebrew, but I'm just going according to what Logos is saying. So I don't know all the so-called the specifics again with what some of these, I guess, actual words, even how to pronounce these words, I have no idea. But just what I found. It gets into another sense, right, is to make strong, to prevail, or to show courage. I don't know, a different sense of the word, but it's to make it stronger, strengthening it. I think that's where we get this idea about steeled, or making it so-called like tougher, or hardening it. So this the second part, or the bottom part of that, says in terms of to make unchanging. So the verb is to make unchanging in will, opinion, or desire. Conceive of as making something hard in substance. And you can see the number of verses there that shows where it was used. This particular Hebrew word was used in these different verses that we've already covered. 7:13, 7:22, 8:19, and 9:12. So this sense of the word was used in those particular verses where it was hardened or strengthened or steeled, I think is the word. Okay, next slide. Two more Hebrew words. The top one, I'll just go through quickly, just making it heavy, weighty, dull, unresponsive. The verb, or no, excuse me, adjective. The adjective is tenaciously unwilling, or marked by tenacious unwillingness to yield. So that adds another look at Pharaoh's heart. That was tenacious and unyielding. Then finally, the fourth one, the bottom half of that page, we see another one, which is touched on earlier, is this idea about being heavy and dull. And those were covered, or this particular word, the Hebrew word, was covered in, listed there 8:15, 8:32, and 9:7. So that was just a quick rundown on what I discovered as I did a word study on the word harden using the Logo software. So that's just a quick rundown. Okay, next slide, please. And here's Durham's comment with regard to the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And I'll just go ahead and read it here. It may well be in the light of this most serious setback to the Egyptians up to this point in the mighty act sequence, as Pharaoh is left alone before Moses, that Yahweh's involvement in Pharaoh's resistance comes for the first time to be stated explicitly. In 8:15, following their failure to produce a swarm of gnats, the learned men, or the Egyptians, the magicians, the learned men of Egypt confessed themselves outdistanced in the presence of a divine power. This is an act of a god. Pharaoh ignored them. His mind remained obstinate. Here, these same learned men, afflicted along with all Egyptians, have no will to further resistance. That's referring to when essentially the magicians failed to reproduce what Moses had done. But let me read the part in green. It is difficult to imagine how Pharaoh could have held out so long, and inconceivable that he could hold out any longer. And so, at the ideal point, we are told plainly what has been implicit all along. Yahweh has made obstinate the mind of Pharaoh. I guess trying to decipher what's being said here, it seems to me that Durham is saying that Pharaoh, being so-called a human, right? That if it was any one of us, with all the plagues that have hit us thus far, we would probably just give up, saying, okay, enough is enough. Go ahead, I'll let the people go. But still, going through the 6 or so plagues thus far, Pharaoh is still tough and still holding out. So this is when I think he's saying that, hey, so here we go. It's God or Yahweh is making Pharaoh's mind to go unyielding. But we'll touch on that a little bit more, because I think we had talked about, or at least was covered briefly last week. But I'll get into it a little bit more. Okay, next slide. So one other resource I turned to as we were looking at this idea about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, which in my mind, whenever I looked at this passage in the past, is this concept, in which we'll get into, is this idea about, I guess, man's free will. And here's the Lutheran Study Bible on its explanation on Exodus 4:21. So I will harden his heart. So with that phrase, and here's the notes from the Study Bible. The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart only after the 6th plague. Prior to that, Pharaoh hardened his own heart against the Lord and continued to do so. So God's action was a judgment against Pharaoh's sin. So what's highlighted in blue is like the explanation when we see when God is so-called taking action now. And that is a judgment against Pharaoh's sin. a little bit more of an explanation on the next slide. Again, from the study Bible, which gets into the note on Exodus 9:12. So the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. Okay, so the Lord confirmed Pharaoh in his persistent unbelief. Even Pharaoh perished in this way. But for this purpose, I raised you up to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. This was not because God had begrudged him salvation, or because it had been his good pleasure that Pharaoh should be damned and lost, for God is not willing that any should perish. And yet God also has no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live. And so here's a reference to Ezekiel 33:11, and also the Formula Concord, the Solid Declaration, Article 11. And give me a second here. Let me pull it up and read some of this here to give you a little bit more sense of what was going on, at least from the Book of Concord. This is taken from Kolb and Wengert, the one that we use in our systematics or the Lutheran Confessions class, I think it was. So this gets into, in Article 11 is concerning God's eternal foreknowledge and election. So maybe I don't want to take the time to really get into it, but if you have time on this question of why did God harden Pharaoh's heart, you could sort of see this explanation from the Solid Declaration. So you could, there's a reference there. So when you have time, you could dig into a little bit more. Okay, I'm going to move on. This another area I had interest in is with regard to the magicians or the sorcerers. So the passage here, to get things started, in the instance of when the staff was turned to a serpent. So in verse 11, we see that the Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they the magicians of Egypt, who did the same by their secret arts. Okay, for each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents, but Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. And then we could just see the parallel translation from Durham on the right. And so call the wise men wise scholars, and magicians and learned men, so just slightly different terminology used. And so they did the same thing with their arcane arts. So next slide. Again, maybe it's a little bit small on your screen, but if you magnify a little bit, you could see what's listed here. So it is just so using the Logos tool again, just to look up what is a sorcerer. So the sorcerer, I'll just read the definition here, is a person who uses or claims to use magical spells to harness evil forces or spirits in order to produce unnatural effects in the world. Likewise, if we were to look at what it means by secret art, it says here, the magic with a focus on the secret and mysterious aspects of those arts. So that's just the definition that in Logos, and trying to determine who these magicians were or the sorcerers and what was meant by secret arts. Next slide. And here's Durham's, commentary on page 91. Okay, they report that Pharaoh's learned men are able to duplicate this wondrous deed is by no means to be taken as an indication that what is described here is nothing more than fancy sleight of hand, making a snake go rigid by pressing on a nerve at the back of its neck. All such attempts to find naturalistic explanations for the wondrous deeds of the book of Exodus, along with designs on what really happened, are not only misleading and impossible, but irrelevant as well. The whole point of this prologue is this miraculous element. The narrator goes to great trouble to make plain that Pharaoh had to call in the best he had to match the wondrous deeds of Moses and Aaron, wise scholars, magicians, learned men with arcane arts. So that's Durham's overall view of what was occurring with these magicians duplicating what was happening before their eyes, right? When Moses and Aaron did their thing. Next slide. So here's another viewpoint commentary. JPS Torah commentary on the words with their spells. Again, some of this is more technical than I could really fully understand because it gets into Hebrew, but I'll just proceed and just read this. Okay, the Hebrew stem LWT means to enwrap, so that the noun would mean things kept under wraps or closely guarded secrets. The use of spells contrasts strongly with the simplicity of Aaron's act, which is unaccompanied by any incantation or praxis. The term itself suggests that the wonder belonged to the magician's conventional repertoire of tricks. In fact, to this day, Egyptian snake charmers practice the deception of turning a rod into a serpent. They are able to induce catatonic rigidity in the native cobra by exerting strong pressure on a nerve just below its head. In this state, the snake assumes a rod-like appearance and can even be handled by onlookers. The jolt it receives when thrown to the ground restores its mobility. So here's an explanation. Now, I'm sure we've seen a lot of magicians on TV and so on, but, well, here's just another perspective on this idea about a staff turning into a serpent, that they were actually holding a cobra to begin with. I'm just throwing that out just for consideration because it's out there. Okay, moving on. Next slide. Again, I'm just doing a comparison between ESV and Durham when it comes to these verses pertaining to the use of the magicians by Pharaoh to so-called duplicate what was going on with this turning the Nile into blood. Okay, next slide. And here we go again, Durham's perspective. Okay, given the context, the same thing thus must refer to the follow-up action of Moses and Aaron. The transformation not of the Nile waters already transformed by Yahweh, but the transformation of channeled or stored water, the source of which is not specified. What is especially important about this brief notice is the status it assigns to the learned men of Egypt as worthy opponents, and two, the fact that these wizards only duplicate what Moses and Aaron have done and make no attempt to undo the disgusting pollution of denial. And the most that can be said for the miracle working is that it is a copy of what Moses and Aaron have accomplished, and that it actually makes matters worse for their master and their people. I thought that was interesting, the way that Durham, or at least his explanation of, yes, they did it, but they just make matters worse. I thought that was a little bit hilarious myself. Next one. Next slide, please. Same thing again with regard to the frogs. They were somehow able to make that happen too, to make more frogs come out from the Nile. And here's a similar explanation for Durham. Next slide. Okay, the action of the learned men of Egypt, by which still more frogs were added to the frog infestation, can hardly have brought any cheer to the befrogged Pharaoh or his court. So verse 3 is an obvious parallel to 7, 11, 12, and 22, and it is significant here, as in 7, 14 to 25, that the Egyptian wizards make no attempt to reduce the effects of Yahweh's acts. They can indeed only multiply them. One wonders, indeed, if in the original tradition these Egyptian learned men attempted to reverse the effect of Yahweh's mighty acts, and against his awesome power could succeed only in multiplying that effect, the very opposite of what they set out to do. The merit of such a suggestion is that it makes sense of the magic of the learned men of Egypt, which in each case only makes the situation worse. The obvious flaw in the suggestion is that it is without basis in the text of Exodus as it was known. So this is Durham's explanation on the situation with the frogs, where essentially maybe the original intent was to reverse the effect, but just make matters worse. So that's a quick rundown of all the various aspects of my section, first covering where we're at in terms of the overall narrative of Exodus, and getting into like an overview of the 10 plagues or the mighty act, looking at the different, I guess, interpretations or the view of the hardening of the heart, the road that the Pharaoh had to begin with, and how God comes in to essentially pass judgment on his hardened heart. And finally, just to touch on the situation with these magicians duplicating what Moses and Aaron was able to do with the Nile and with the frogs. So that's pretty much it. I went through pretty quickly, but there's a lot of things that we could really get into, and probably a lot of questions. But okay, let me just leave it at that, because it's almost time already. Time goes by fast.
So thank you, Baron, and you're getting lots of encouragement from your classmates in the chat column. Anyone have a question or observation? Yeah, Travis, please.
Oh, I was just going to ask, because I don't know if anybody's seen it, and probably everybody has, but on the History Channel there was quite an extensive scientific explanation of the plagues, and I wondered what the thought was about these plagues being totally just divine, like God just came in and did these things, or did he use his creation to make them happen? Kind of, I don't know if I'm explaining that right, but I kind of think he's used what he already created to do supernatural things. It's not like he just came in and threw a bunch of frogs in there. He used an event that he knew would happen because he is of his divinity. And so I just wondered if there was any thought on that as they were going through, as Barron was going through these plagues, if he's noticed anything from Durham or when his own research.
Well, when I first, saw what was, getting into when it comes to these different plagues, I was trying to see if there was sort of like significance in, I guess, even why he picked frogs and flies and so on. Then also, like the question you pose, are the things that we see, like the now turning into blood, is that, so-called real blood, right? Or is it more like, as other commentators might say things like, oh, well, that's just the algae in the water and it just looks like blood. I think that's a question that I think we probably all have in terms of when God does things, do we try to like rationalize and try to find some so-called scientific explanation, or do we just take it as, hey, God is God, he's able to do these things? But I'll maybe let Professor Achterbach maybe try to address that, because I really didn't really delve into it too much, as I was a little bit more interested in my portion on this idea about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, and then I thought it was interesting how the so-called the magicians was able to also do some of this.
Yeah, okay, thank you both, Timothy and Barron. There were a couple other hands up, so let's see what the other students have to add. Who's next? Maybe Carlos, did you have a question or comment?
Hello, can you hear me? Just to try to put in some words the idea of Travis about if it's the divine intervention or, well, natural outcome also as a result of God intervention. It's okay, just understanding.
Okay, someone else has a question?
No,
No,
it was
no.
not. It was not a question. It was an adding on that comment too on the Travis. What the sources they try to explain, because I was thought that when I was in Catholic actually and in secondary, and they got the explanations on every single thing of the plagues, but the only they added on that this thing happening in a time and a moment that shouldn't be happening. So that was that's how they explained that the things can happen, but they happen at the right time and the right moment because of the hand of God. And that's why they explained that it can be happening.
Okay, gotcha. Good comment. Okay, thanks. Timothy Norton again.
So I haven't asked the question before, but so I like you're bringing this thing out about the learned men or the wise men, Baron. Do you have any people in your community, your congregation that are involved in this sort of demonic stuff?
Not in my particular setting in my community, but I've had heard stories among sort of the Hmong people, shamans and so on, like where I guess demonic powers is something that we don't take lightly. Maybe there is some abilities of the so-called dark forces that is beyond our understanding as humans. So, but in the end, God wins. So we need not fear. But that's the best I could sort of answer your question, Tim.
Okay, thank you both.
Amen.
Yeah, thank you, Jose.
Yeah, I just want to mention what I think it was David already mentioned it, but yeah, there's a movie called, I believe it's The Ripening, with I can't remember her name, Hilary Duff, I think, or one of those actors, and they go through explaining the plagues, how the plagues. I guess they try to explain it scientifically, the reasons and why this and that happened, the blood, the frogs, etc. And but it was interesting to me, and when I heard it, it was interesting to me to hear how they tried to give a scientific explanation of what happened in Exodus, and so I guess the Hebrews or the writers of the Exodus, they deemed that as miracles from God. They interpret it as miracles from God. But one of the problems, as David mentioned, is the timing is everything. When Moses is going there and trying to do what God has called him to do, is and everything is happening at the time that he's saying that's going to happen. So the timing, you can't, even if you have that scientific explanation, you can't explain the timing. Let me see, I had some other thought, but I think it escaped me. Thank you.
All right. Thank you both. Brian?
Yeah, I was just looking back at the verse 19 in chapter 7, just to comment on the blood and that miracle. The thing that stood out to me in that I thought was interesting was it was all the vessels, both wood and stone, in addition to the reservoirs and the Nile that turned to blood. And some of the commentaries I've been reading on, mentioned that it was also in respect to everything stored, as was usual in houses, contained either in vessels of wood or vessels of stone. And I didn't really consider that before, but thought that would have been something to go to your refrigerator and pull out a pitcher of water in today's world and have it blood. And I just wonder what you thought of that.
Baron? I think that's questions to you.
Right. Well, all I could say is only God could do such things. One thing to say denial because of certain so-called trying to natural or rationalize, try to explain how that happens with the algae and so on. But if it's already in all these other containers, also I pick up on that too. I say to myself, hey, when that occurs, that kind of amazing thing, it has to be God.
Okay, good. Clarence?
All right. Hello, you guys can hear me? Great. Well, one of the things that connects for me is that the priests themselves are being paid. That this is their job, and part of it is to fool the people, and maybe even fool the Pharaoh. And I think that's what distinguishes this from parlor tricks, from miracles. I think that Moses had, because Moses is not getting paid in no way. He didn't even want to do this. So in many senses, there's a difference in that sense. So I think maybe on the Egyptian side, they're just trying to figure out, what's this guy's motivation, what's behind all his parlor tricks here. But when it came to the time when things are getting killed off, I think that's when they finally realized, we're dealing with something that we don't even know about. In Hawaiian culture, it was real evident that a lot of the things were parlor tricks. And I saw a documentary on the Greek temples. They had created these machines that like boulders would roll down these wooden things to create the sound of thunder, and they would have mirrors and stuff and flashes to make lights come on inside, again to fool the people and even to scare the people. So I was wondering what you thought of that, both you guys.
Yeah, Baron, you go first and then I'll go.
Well, I'm here again. I wouldn't be surprised if they did such things to somehow, fool the people. But on the other hand, the way that these so-called plagues, as they unfolded, whether it be, the Nile or like the frogs, I don't know how you could do some kind of so-called trick to make that happen. That's just my off-the-cuff explanation or feedback.
Yeah, I think you have a good insight there, Baron, is that to make some water into blood, but for the whole of the Nile and what's in every vessel and all around, that's a kind of a different character. I just wanted to reference also in Daniel, when Nebuchadnezzar had his dreams, he's already suspicious about the magicians in their craft, if you will. And so he tells the magicians, I'm not going to tell you what my dream is. You have to tell me my dream and its explanation. And of course, they're all complaining and say, nobody ever asks this kind of a thing of a magician. And of course, Daniel comes and does it. So there are various ways that the Bible authenticates the narrative that it records as being in fact miraculous and not some kind of
Well, and
okay, well, go ahead.
one follow up too. I always equate this to, God is behind this, definitely. Like in the story of Job, he's behind, but he gives permission to the devil to do these things to Job. So, in a sense, I guess this may be happening here, that God is behind, but he's giving permission for these magicians to do all this silly stuff, and maybe Satan is helping them. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. And in the next hour, I'll give you or refer to some of the other places in the New Testament, especially that talk about God granting the devil the ability to do lying signs and wonders. So you're onto something there. Yeah. Okay, Andrew.
Well, Lucas had his hand up. I don't know if that was me or not.
Okay, hear me? Yeah, just the first thing was like with in verse 24, chapter 7. I can what I have to say is like the order of the plagues in this. I know Durham didn't think there was much to it, but basically to me it seems like the first one, the Nile made Egypt. And so when Moses turned it to blood, I mean, that got the attention of all of Egypt, especially drinking water. And in verse 24, it says, all the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the Nile. But then it seems to me it's like the first 2 or 3 plagues were just kind of like inconveniences, and then they seem to get progressively worse. But for why frogs and why 10 plagues? I guess I could say why 10 commandments, why 10? Is it just that number 10 again that we see in the New Testament used for 10 of completeness? So why frogs and why 10?
Baron, do you have an answer for the frog question or the 10 question?
No, I think you're probably better able to answer the question because I know that numbers do mean a lot.
Okay.
A little bit beyond my knowledge at this point.
All right. Well, actually, the answer to both questions comes from Revelation, and I'll show you a text later that says, well, in the vision of the anti-father, anti-son, anti-spirit, the dragon and the 2 beasts in Revelation, it says that frogs came out of their mouths, and it had to do with lies and deception and so forth. Frogs has to do with lying spirits, so I got that far. 10, like the commandments, is indicative of the law, and especially the laws that are laws describing what is required to live in God's universe. And so like the 10 commandments, you can be sure that in those 10 commandments, you know what is required to live. Of course, you can collapse those into 2 like Jesus did. So the 10 plagues also has to do with kind of in a material universe, the laws that are at work. And in this case, who's in control of those laws and who isn't, who's only pretending to be, and then of course losing ground as we saw. Okay, good question. Lucas.
Thanks, Professor. Hey, Baron, appreciate the presentation. Hey, I've done a little bit of reading on I guess a theory called accessibilism, and there's a book called Eternity in Their Hearts, and it has the Chinese language teaching Christian doctrine, and it's 4,000 or 5,000 year old language. Have you ever seen anything in the Old Testament, I can use Exodus as an example, that teaches the truth of the Bible when you look at the characters for, Hebrew words,
Is that question for Baron or for me?
Baron. Yeah, Baron.
Yeah, good. I thought
Unless
so.
you know Chinese, Professor.
Well, I wish I did.
Well, if you're alluding to, I guess, the meaning of how the Chinese characters are formed, yeah, I know a little bit, but not a whole lot, because there are a lot of things that you could look up on even certain words of sort of the connections to the Bible and the story from the Bible, like the grand narrative and so on. But in particular, from your question, I don't really have an answer because I really don't know exactly. I just know a little bit about the Chinese characters in some instances, but relating it to like the Old Testament itself, I don't have a whole lot of knowledge in that area.
Actually, I can refer all of you, if to the extent you're interested, to a colleague of mine here, Dr. Jack Schultz. Is an anthropologist, and one of the things that he's come across in his studies, his own research among Native American people, but I think he's probably also knows where to look for this in other languages and cultures, is he has told me that he has found stories or narratives that parallel especially Old Testament texts, but even New Testament ideas at least, and so you could certainly email him if you wanted to pursue something along those lines. And Travis has his hand up yet, unless Lucas has something else, and then let's take our break after Travis. I'll note that when Travis is done, and then we'll take a.
Okay, yeah, I was just gonna, because the only reason I brought that up is just to not necessarily totally discount science. They do try to over-explain, I think, but there was a progression of things that you can kind of make sense of, like the frogs being piled up, and then the gnats coming, and the flies with these piles of frogs laying around. And I don't disagree that God had His hand in that whole thing, but you just kind of you wonder. And I say this for myself because I was so eager before to just discount science and to try to tell them, you don't know what you're talking about. But there is a point where they come together, and I think God uses His creation that He made to make these things happen. And yeah, science might have a bit of a clue on it, but we know the total truth. And that's kind of why I brought that discussion up, because it's hard for me to talk to people that are stuck in that science realm to say, well, no, this couldn't have happened or that couldn't have happened. But really, it could have happened. It was just God doing it. And that's why I was just curious what people thought about that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good discussion, and we heard about the timing of things, and that's a really important observation to make. Also, C.S. Lewis talks about the miracles, saying it's not that God's doing something that He doesn't already do. For example, turning water into wine. I mean, that is what God does with grapes and all of the components of grapes that eventually become wine. So there's the on command, there's the pace at which something happens. But I also wanted to speak to this because I deal with this all the time in the classroom. What should we call it? You know, in the 1800s, theologians too quickly abandoned religion because they were afraid it was going to prove them wrong, but that can't be the case because of what God says about science and nature and why He created it. And so, just for example, early in my classes, when I talk about these kinds of things in general with undergrad students, I ask them, what do they suppose, for example, a 8 or 10,000 year old universe looks like if you start digging it up or putting it under microscopes or running tests on it? And the reason I ask a question and ask that question is because it's impossible for them to argue or even claim that what the Genesis narrative is describing and what the Bible presents to us as history and kind of a young earth, if you will, you can't disprove that. And why couldn't it, wouldn't it, shouldn't it look just like what scientists are claiming they're looking at? It's just that their numbers need adjusting. Similarly, you know, in the creeds, we talk about the Nicene Creed, we believe in the visible and invisible. And, you know, historically, that would have made sense. In our time, we maybe could nuance that a little because we have instrumentations now. You know, people have made inventions that allow us to see what was previously unseeable, from X-ray machines to all kinds of electronic instruments and so forth. And so I suppose, I mean, when the Son of God was conceived of the Virgin Mary, and when we say the words of institution over bread and wine, real things happen in real time and space. And if we had the scientific instruments to observe what took place, we would observe that it really actually takes place in time and space. And so what we get the advantage, we get our cake and eat it, if you will. God produced these mighty acts, as Durham noted, exactly when he wanted them to take place and exactly as he had intended, for exactly the purpose he had in mind. And ultimately, that's for the salvation of all people, for our learning and edification and warning and help and life. So we're going to be grateful and very grateful for Baron's presentation. And so we're still going to stick to our 10-minute break. Well, maybe 9 minutes, but I'll try and be efficient in the last part of our time together here. So I'll see you back in 9 minutes at 20 after. Okay, it's a minute early, but it looks like everybody's back, and so we'll try and make the most of the time. Just to make a couple comments in general, because we may not have time at the end. But again, thank you, Baron, for a great presentation. I think the class benefits a lot from so far in just 2 presentations, a contrast between the way Brian approached working through the material and the way Baron did. So I think Brian, kind of similar to what I'm doing, working through the text sort of as the text presents itself. Baron deciding to do a couple of things. One is to give us some really good exposure to the commentary, and not just Durham's commentary, but to some others, including the Lutheran Study Bible. I just wanted to make a note, because in case everybody's not familiar, but the publisher's copyright date for Keil and Delitzsch is 1996, but Keil and Delitzsch wrote in 1887. I looked that up just to make sure. I was pretty sure they were 19th century guys, but a good, reliable commentary. So use that if you're pursuing commentaries. Also, then, Baron was working on a couple particular ideas. So the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, which got him into some particular language and translation questions, and then the business about the magicians and the magic arts. That's valuable time to spend. So, you know, between just getting a reliable translation, which would be a semester's worth, more than a semester's worth, and as Baron was looking at Logos and what it had to offer, I was flipping through my Hebrew Old Testament here in Exodus and checking what the verses said, just to make sure I was keeping up. And so translation, and then that just the exegesis from a technical Hebrew grammar approach would take a long time. And then there's the theology of all of this, and then there's observations about concepts, and then there's applications. So as you can see, there's way more here than we have time to do, but we're getting a nice sample of things. So as the rest of you prepare for your presentations, you can kind of use your judgment about how to give us the best of what your text has to offer. Back in 7.2, just one thing in Baron noted about Durham's translation, he won't let the people go. The word is shalach in Hebrew, and it's a pal, which it's a form of the verb, which is intense. And so in 7 verse 2, it reads a little more like this. So God says to Aaron, you shall speak, well, Moses, you shall speak all that I command you, and Aaron your brother shall speak to Pharaoh, and that it's either in order to let the people go, but it's not an infinitive, so that doesn't quite sound right either. Or the conjunction should be that, so that he will send the people out of Israel, and in a very intense way, and that is consistent with the narrative later on in Exodus, when that's exactly what happens. So at the Passover, Pharaoh is finally convinced, and that's even predicted, that he's going to send you out because of God's activity and so forth. Okay, getting into what I have on the screen here then for you. And I'm just going to be able to give you highlights in terms of how much time we have. But the beauty of recording these sessions is you can go back and look through them. And if you want to, you know, you can move forward through the recording to get to a place where the section of my notes is up here that you want to look at. And then you can have all the time you want to study on that if you like. I wanted to start again with a look at these questions from my Old Testament students. Notice there's just a couple here, but one of them, Baron, hits the spot. They were curious how the magicians made the frogs come up and so forth. And so here's these references I mentioned. So 2 Corinthians 11 talks about the devil disguises himself as an angel of light, and they'll do signs and wonders, but they're lies. And Revelation, again, in plenty of passages, talks about the devil and his beasts and his angels, demonic angels doing lying signs and wonders. And I just read today in Mark, same thing. Jesus talks about, giving signs and wonders to the opposition to do. And part of that's in order to test both wicked, or both what believers and unbelievers. It's not unlike how God brought Israel kind of not the fastest way out of Egypt either, which caused that uncomfortable night for Israel when the Red Sea's on one side and Pharaoh's armies on the other, to demonstrate his control again and his power, and how he is the right place to the right person to be dependent on, and again slowly taking them through the wilderness so that they could learn his ways and come to be confident in him, and so forth. Okay. I put this first note here in yellow: if Moses is God, who is Pharaoh? Because I want to keep reminding you that towards the end of the semester, there's that essay coming about the whole of the Exodus being a paradigm or a model of salvation of any human being. And I wanted just to remind you also that fallen human nature is evident in all of the people in biblical history. So human nature, my human nature, as you know, in Mark 7, where Jesus talks about what the heart is full of, that's my heart and any human heart. And so, from Judas Iscariot to Saul to David and Goliath and Pharaoh and the whole works, that's a serious warning about my own human nature and the threat it poses against my own life and well-being, and God's remedies for that. And then similarly, the faithful nature of faithful people you see in the Bible, from Ruth, and Saul's son Jonathan, to Peter and Paul and John and Andrew and Noah and Daniel and all the rest. That is a regenerated soul in the life of a believer, and that's all describing us too. All right. So we had a lot of good time with heart hardening tonight. I have something to come back to in regards to that, but I'll save that because it's at the end of my pages here. So I'll look at a couple things with you right before our time ends. Just in general, in terms of how redemption works. So we're watching God redeem Israel in the Exodus, and that is a model of how God redeems any given person. What I wanted to note here is how typical it is, almost universal, that people in our time, in our world, think one-dimensionally. So there's a material person in time and space, and that's all there is to us, which means they read everything in the Bible as a kind of a percentage. So there are wicked and evil people in the Bible, and there are faithful and good people in the Bible, and we're all trying to be more faithful and good than wicked and evil, and hopefully the percentage of success in that is adequate for us to have hope and go to heaven when we die. That is not the model from the creation account in Genesis through the Gospels in Jesus and Revelation. But the Bible posits a three-dimensional universe, and so three-dimensional anthropology, which allows the Bible to talk about our human nature in terms of 100% failure. And you can read about that, for example, in Romans 5. It's actually verses 6 through 10, or in Ephesians, that should be 2. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. That's where the 3 came from. And so the redemption and work of Christ provides also 100% forgiveness and imputation of righteousness to our human nature, and also now a third aspect of God's redemptive work, 100% success of the regenerate soul. So John 3 and 1 John many, many times through chapters 3 through 5 describes the regenerate soul of the redeemed in absolutely perfect terms. So language like, indeed they cannot sin because they have been generated by God. So I have a little diagram to look at later regarding that. But I just want you also to kind of consider these two different models, the one-dimensional model of our world in contrast with a three-dimensional, and see how that affects your thinking as you read Exodus and think about it being a narrative of God's redemptive work. I just noticing here, God's going to bring Israel out with mighty acts of judgment, and it just occurred to me, when God broke Peter out of prison, he did it in the night, and he did it while everyone was asleep, and so nobody saw what was happening, and even though the guards were executed because of that. But just if we had time, it would be interesting to compare the differences in the circumstances or the similarities, but just thinking in terms of bringing people out of somewhere. So that makes us think of the 3 men in the fiery furnace and Daniel in the lion's den, and well, lots of other occasions that we could kind of put them all, stack them up, and have a look and see what we learn. Okay, the narrative digresses a little bit in 7:7 and following, and so the backstory, and the Bible often does this. They kind of plow into the narrative and then look back from time to time to tell you what's going on. So again, in the Gospel of Mark, long after John the Baptizer's been beheaded, you kind of get to that narrative when it says, you know, Herod heard about Jesus and he thought he was John the Baptizer risen from the dead, therefore these powers were at work in him, and so forth. So just kind of understanding how biblical narrative works often. We looked at, talked about the purpose of miracles last week, and Baron gave us some good exposure to the sorcerers and their magic arts. I too had noticed and appreciated what Durham had to say about the sorcerers making things worse instead of better, and so they didn't actually have anything, any way to help. And so really, what power did they have? Also, I was noticing, I looked up about the serpent and swallowing the other serpents. And so, you know, if this is a parlor trick, like this business of pressure points on a serpent's back or something, that still wouldn't account for the fact that one of the serpent's errands, namely, swallows the other serpents and they're gone. So I checked a little bit on that aspect, and Durham didn't really, he said it was comical, actually. But Augustine, actually, if you have access to the ancient Christian commentary of the Bible, Augustine had a lot to say on that subject, and he's kind of taking off in a direction that I was thinking of too. And this will work for you all through the Bible whenever you're doing studies in exegetical work, is if you can at any level think about parallels. And so when you think about one thing swallowing another, so you might have recalled, and I think I put this in the chat thing earlier, but the lean grain, the blighted grain, and the lean cows in Pharaoh's 2 dreams, which were about the same thing, swallowing up the fat, so the fat wouldn't be remembered because of the lean. And so, so of course the years of plenty in Egypt were forgotten because of the severity of the famine. Is there some kind of insight or parallel into what's going on here in Egypt? In other words, what God has in store for Pharaoh is going to swallow up all of the glory, all of the pretense, all of the savings, the whole bounty of Egypt. And we may suspect we're onto something there, because this is one of the complaints near the end of the plagues, is the Pharaoh's servants are advisors say, haven't you yet realized that, Egypt is a wasteland, it's gone. And so that begins to take a little effect in getting Pharaoh to change his mind, but not ultimately. Okay, in contrast, Barron mentioned about how Durham uses mighty acts instead of plagues, and I checked, that word's not used very often, interestingly, in the Bible. In contrast to that, the word harden, uh, um, 14 out of 44 times in the Bible is in Exodus, but that's just one form of the root sklei in Greek. So I was pursuing this in the Greek Old Testament because that lets me work in both testaments at the same time, pursuing the same roots. So much more prominence in this word to harden a heart. And as Barron noticed tonight, there are several different words not typically used with this idea of hardening a heart. So kavod as in heavy, and chazak to be hard or harsh, that sort of thing. So a lot of work still to be done to build on what Barron got us started with. I wanted to just spend a moment here too on this request, let my people go that they may serve me in the wilderness. And the sequence, how the Exodus story is going to anticipate the sequence of the Son of God, or vice versa, and our own. And so this is a moment where we're looking at the Exodus as a narrative or a paradigm of human salvation. And so it starts with birth, or we should actually back it up to conception, and then birth in the promised land, so something like within God's providence. And then I put in parentheses, not parentheses, quotation marks, escape to Egypt, because it's not so much an escape as it is a matter of necessity, this movement from promised land to Egypt, which starts out as a land of plenty, but then becomes a place of capitulation, maybe, or bondage. And I'm just given some ideas here that would take time to pursue if you had the time, or if we had the time. And then, of course, the parallel becomes much more clear here, the passing through the water in the Red Sea. And Paul confirms that for us in 1 Corinthians 10. So that's a predecessor of baptism. And then moving in. And then we get the wilderness and the temptations, which end up for 40 years. So Jesus driven from his baptism into the wilderness to be tempted. And of course 40, so the combination of 4, a term that describes the material creation, in 10, the number of the law. So what does it take to survive or live in God's material world? And so you see Jesus fulfilling that in Matthew 4 and in Luke 4. And then Jesus goes from there into his public ministry and all the rest. And then Israel, of course, passes through the Jordan into the promised land, which is illustrative of, or indicative, or parallel to, however would best describe a person's passage into everlasting life, or in Jesus' case, in his ascension, he ascends up into the clouds, which is visible water, and passes through to sit at the right hand of God. Okay, I was eager to get back to this little business about the magic and the secret arts, and some historical investigations into how magicians practiced their deceit, at least the deceit part of what they did. And when I was studying in Israel, including Jordan, we had the opportunity to go to Jerish, and there was a really, I think this is it. I'm not positive, but it's close enough for our purposes. But some really excellent ruins in Jerish. And one of the things we had a chance to look at is there was an altar up around here that had a pool connected to it, and the priests were said to have been able to turn water into wine. And so what we were shown is that back behind this, of course, was an aqueduct that provided the water, but there was also a reservoir of wine, and there was a little shuttle in this pool. And so on command, or when he wanted to, the priest would move that shuttle, and it would shut off the flow of water and open the reservoir of wine, and there you go, presto, changeo, and the water now has become wine. Not so easy, I think, water into blood, especially universally so water into blood. But one of the things about the water in the Nile is that it was a temporary um, consequence. So in other words, I've been on the Nile too, studying in Egypt, and that's fast moving water. And so, the text doesn't say how far up the Nile the water was turned into blood, but regardless, sooner than later, the source of the Nile is going to make its way down, and the blood will be flushed out into the Mediterranean and replaced with new water from upstream. And then, when people would have poured out their vessels that had water in them, now blood, they would have poured those out, and so things will be restored. I'm still interested in the significance of those two elements, water and blood. Brian, I think, mentioned last week, those two elements coming from the side of Christ, and that they have their own significance. But just both of those associated with life, inside and outside of the body, and so forth. So a lot of work could be done there as time would permit. So here's the frogs. I pulled that quote from Durham also, but here is this reference to Revelation. The doctrine of demons is what frogs were all about. Besides, I just think they're, geez, to have frogs everywhere, if you step on them, they're kind of squishy, but not, they have bones in them and creepy, and what a mess. And so, yeah. One thing also I haven't been able to get to the bottom of yet, and I didn't know if how many of you noticed, but there's no record of Moses using the leprous hand, and I just wondered why that is. So someday I hope to get back to that. So I'm going to move a little faster here and skip a lot of things. I wanted to just note here, if we're keeping record of the signs, so we had the rods and the snakes and how that all worked out, and then no record of the leprous hand and why that may or may not have been. I just was wondering if Moses wasn't afraid to use that sign, just because what if his hand didn't get restored? I don't know, but just an initial thought. And water to blood. I'll come back to this, looking at this, all the sequence of plagues in a minute. Hard hardening, we did. Swarms of flies. Distinctions. So the God of distinctions, God says he will set apart the land of Goshen. Wanted to at least alert you to, there's another tangent that a person could follow out of the Exodus narrative, is God's ability to make distinctions, especially distinctions of the heart. So God sees the heart, knows the inner thoughts of man, and so not subject to misdirected or miscalculated assessments of people. So Jesus in the Gospels will say, don't judge by what your eyes see, but judge with a right judgment. But I wondered, did Israel have blood in their water vessels too? And did they have frogs all among them too? Or had God already distinguished between those peoples? I'd be interested in looking for an answer for that sometime when it can. Again, yeah, Clarence, go ahead.
One of the theories I thought was frogs come when the flood comes, and maybe this time that they're in Egypt is not a flood time. So that's the miracle. These frogs are appearing.
Yeah, I haven't come across any reason to think that there was a flood. And again, um, there's a whole science of how the Nile was regulated, or how it functioned, and that's another subject that would be interesting to look into a little more closely. There are Nilometers, they're called, all along the Nile, on the banks where pharaohs, analogous to tax agents, were keeping track year by year how the Nile was doing, and people were assessed um, um, on the basis of how much water there was, because that would determine how fruitful their crops would be. And I see I got to hustle here because we're almost out of time. Again, I was interested in this, another look back, dishonesty having to do with God then Moses about what they proposed to do, and I think it's on the next slide. Yeah, so is God being deceptive and then by way of Moses saying we're going to go 3 days journey in the wilderness and sacrifice, and then I was thinking even I wasn't sure if he'd said we'd come back or not. So the what it means, the significance of using the term 3 days into the wilderness and then sacrifice. I was thinking also of since Pharaoh doesn't actually have a legitimate claim on the children of Israel, just like Esau, after he sold his birthright, didn't have a claim to it either. And so, you know, it's hard for us to be sympathetic when Esau complains that Jacob deceived Isaac in order to get the blessing, because that was Jacob's fair and square. It was Esau's fault for trading it away because he was hungry and he wanted a bowl of stew. One note quickly here: only let not Pharaoh deal falsely. So notice that Pharaoh's method here of complying and then changing his mind is warned. So we had some good information about sort of first Pharaoh's hardening his own heart, and then God hardens it as a conclusion of judgment. That's in the language of Matthew 12 and Hebrews 6 and 10 as well. I'm going to move just real quickly here so you can see some things. Okay, so here's just a little work I did on this business of predestination and the hardening of hearts and that sort of thing. And so you'll see how the language works here, having to do with contention. So certainly Pharaoh would have contended he had a free will, since he would even claim that he was divine, God. So it's contentiousness that puts a person in opposition to God, which makes the person who is contentious responsible for the consequences of that. Contrast that: if we in honesty and humility make no claims for free will, then universal atonement is effective and there's no condemnation to complain about. And so therefore only the contention for freedom of choice puts a person under the consequences of being contentious. So there's 1 step, 2 steps, and then a conclusion, and then some questions to follow up. I'm just going to let you know that that's there, and you can come back to it if you want to spend some time thinking about it. This is a little diagram that I use with students to contrast these two world views, and it's been very helpful, and the students are starting to get things too. This right here, that is this, and this model of a one-dimensional universe, especially starting with Darwin and then adding Freud and then a very crass materialism, and then even the kind of angry, obnoxious atheism of Dawkins. But this does describe and account for our experience in our time. This is, in contrast, the biblical model of relationship between male responsible for them, the Son of God responsible for that, the Father responsible for all things. So maybe more on that next week if we have more time. I wanted you to see, I think it is worth spending some time on these plagues. I did notice too, and this happens a lot in Hebrew literature, is that blood seems to be a hinge. So early on, how does Moses authenticate himself, or how does God authenticate Moses? Rod, leprosy, blood, and then blood is counted as the first of the 10 plagues. And then I was thinking about Revelation and the bowls filled with plagues that are poured out. And so by a couple different means here, I was comparing the two. There's no parallel that I found so far. I have not done looking about gnats, flies, and animals dying in Revelation. But locusts are involved in Revelation, and scorpions and dragons and stuff like that too. So anyway, in this section of text, I wanted to just isolate the Pharaoh. So Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and what kind of narrative follows each time he has something to say or a reaction. And there's the next, and I was tracking in the sides what's going on with the plagues and trying to color code that to make it easier to track. And gnats and flies and dead animals and boils and hail and lightning and thunder. Lightning and thunder also prominent in Revelation. And then locusts, and then darkness, and then the Passover, and then this pillar of cloud and fire. This is the last time that I went this far in the text because I wanted to track Pharaoh all the way through. And then I just wanted to show you, so here plagues, 120 times plagues in the Bible, but not very much in Exodus. And so some English translations use the word in Exodus 8 and 9, but it's not there in Hebrew. So just these 3 times in Exodus. Another word for plague, only 15 times in the Bible. And that kind of is interesting because it throws us back to God afflicting Pharaoh and his house with plagues because he had taken Sarah, and so forth. So folks, I'm a minute over, sorry, but this is recorded and it's there for you, and look forward to seeing you on Thursday and continuing with our next presenter in the rest of the study. God bless you in your studies tonight, and until we see you again. Good night.